I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you all for coming. Let me begin by acknowledging the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Boston Foundation, Raytheon, the Lowell Institute, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, NECN, and WBUR. We're thrilled to be partnering with WGBH this evening to help premiere Freedom Riders, a new American experience documentary which airs nationally on PBS on May 16th, and to have as our moderator Callie Crossley from WGBH's The Callie Crossley Show, and also a regular on Greater Boston's Friday night Beat the Press. Callie also served as a producer of the Eyes on the Prize documentary series. We're short on time this evening, and I did want everyone to know the film lasts about 2 hours, and then we'll have a conversation after that for about 45 minutes. So we plan to end this evening at 8:15, and the buses, if you took public transportation, will be running through 8:30. But there's really no better way to introduce our speakers, Genevieve Hughes, Bernard Lafayette Jr., and Ernest Rip Patton, than simply to watch this incredible film. But before doing so, I wanted to thank our three guest speakers. You honor us this evening with your presence, and we are a far better country for your courage and convictions that helped us as a people move closer to the ideals on which this country was founded. Now on with the show.
Genevieve Hughes Houghton, Ernest Rip Patton Jr. We're all delighted to have them here. For those of you who have not attended a Kennedy Forum before, I will ask a few questions, and then later on, as you see there are microphones in the aisle, I will entertain some questions from you, not comments, some questions to our guests, and we will enjoy a wonderful, enriching conversation for all of us. Well, I got to start in a way that I think many of us would want to know after having watched you up on that screen. What do you all feel like looking at your young selves in the film?
Despair.
What does it feel like, Rip Patton?
I think things are, in a sense, the same as they were in '61. I still feel the same. I'm busy doing the work, so it hasn't stopped.
Bernard Lafayette?
Well, I was asked, since I've seen it so many times, that I want to sit in the back and take a nap. But I just want to take a little nap. But what I did was, each time I see it, even this time, I recognize myself again. And I hadn't seen myself in certain places. So I feel a sense that it's a distance for me psychologically, and yet when I see the film, it reconnects me emotionally with that particular period. And then once again, I remember the feeling I had when I was done. So it's a build-up. Each time I see it, I feel closer and closer to that experience.
And what was the feeling you had at that time?
Well, one of the things I felt was that we were going to succeed. There was never a moment, whether it was at the bus station being beaten up, or whether it was being arrested and put in parchment. There was not one moment that I ever doubted that things were going to change.
And Genevieve, for you, by the way, Bernard was 20, Genevieve was 28, and Ernest Rip Patton was 21.
Well, I felt the same way Bernard felt. I felt we were at the right point to really win. And that's one reason I was so enthusiastic about going on it, you know. I like to win. It's a wonderful feeling.
And what were you feeling, Robert? Ernest?
The same as Bernard, because we came from the same background as far as the civil rights movement was concerned with our sit-ins in Nashville. And we had been very successful in Nashville. And so the Freedom Rides, Nashville was like a little battle. And the Freedom Ride was more like getting into the war. Nashville was a local movement, and the Freedom Ride was more of a national movement. And so we just had the faith and the confidence. We knew that the Nashville students would back us up because of the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth wave. Nashville had the largest contingency of Freedom Riders, and Tennessee State had the largest within the Nashville area of people to go on the Freedom Ride. So we knew that that group would back us up, but we didn't necessarily know that it would grow as it did. Of course, that's what we wanted, and that's what we did in Nashville, was to fill the jails, and we wanted to fill all the jails in Jackson, Mississippi. We didn't know about Parchment, though.
Yeah, that was not a jail. That was something else. Because we have the advantage here of everyone having seen the film, I can ask you all some larger themed issues. Something that comes up all the time, and I bet for all of you who speak to students frequently, is that how do you know how it was going to turn out at the end? They're a little afraid to engage sometimes in something they can't see down the road how it's going to turn out. And I say all the time, these people didn't know. They didn't know how it was going to turn out. So you just decided, I'm going to be committed to this because. Explain that. What drives you to jump in, particularly after you've signed an application that says you may lose your life? Don't everybody jump. I will call on you. Genevieve, why don't you start while Bernard is thinking?
All right. I felt, and possibly I felt incorrectly, that I had a pretty good knowledge of the white middle class, and I knew they felt guilty. I just knew them well enough that they would support this, which means the money, among other things, to carry on, and the money to form new chapters. I felt it was overdue, in fact. I felt people had been ready for quite a while, and that gave me confidence because, you know, however terrible it was in the Deep South, it was not that terrible towards the North. You know, I got terrific support. I remember I went somewhere in our apartment building and we had a little party, and I asked people to donate, and they donated $700. Well, this was 50 years ago. These were just the people who lived in our apartment building. So for me, that kind of response tells me something.
And what did you think your presence being on those buses, being a part of the Freedom Rides, might say to somebody else looking from the outside?
Well, I think they'd have to puzzle over it for a bit. I mean, here we were, a integrated group which hadn't been that way before. They'd have to figure it out. And I knew that some people were going to be very antagonized. That was obvious. But I thought we would win.
All right. Rip?
Well, I always go back to the sit-ins in Nashville because I think for Nashville, that's where it started. We had our training from Dr. Lawson, and the training that we had brought us together, the students together. And so we knew that no matter what, as Bernard said in the piece, no matter what, we would come. The first wave would go, and he was leading the second wave. And so Jim Swerg had said that he was the one most likely to be attacked and to be killed. And Bernard said, well, no matter what, I'm bringing the second group. And the group that was more or less not following him, but the group that was with him felt the same way. I was in the third group. I felt when it was time for my group to go, there was no problem. I didn't have a second thought.
But how? Why was that? Why was that? I mean, so
Because
let's say there were 30 of you, or there's 60 more outside of that group. What made you all
numbers
do it?
had nothing to do with it.
But
this was my own individual decision to
right.
make.
Why? So
and
why?
Because I knew that it was the right thing to do. It was something that I wanted to do. And it was something that I had been trained to do, to overcome fear and to know that we were doing the right thing.
And for you, Bernard Lafayette?
I wasn't prepared to live with segregation and discrimination. So if it took death to stop it, so be it. I wasn't going to live with it.
And what had happened to you in your life that got you to the point of saying, I must do something to change this, and I believe I can?
Well, it was my grandmother. I was 7 years old, and she was my leader. And I'd seen her do some things that were not ordinary. And I wanted to follow in her footsteps. She, like for example, in Tampa, Florida, she went and bought an orange grove and got some lots, cut them up, sold people lots, and they got Walton to help them build houses on them. She opened up a grocery store. I was standing right there when the fellow was digging the foundation, and she told him how deep to build the foundation. And when she came back, it wasn't deep enough. And he said, well, I know what the code is, okay? This is sufficient for one-story, grocery store. She built a grocery store. She finished her 3rd grade. Okay? In fact, you look like my grandmother.
Oh. I'm sure she was 20 that you're remembering her at 20.
She looked at him and she told him, I told you to dig it deeper. I'm building a 1-story building, but Junior might want to put another story on it, and if you don't dig the foundation deep enough, you can't get another story. So it was a 2-story store that she was thinking about, even though she was going to do the 1-story. So it's the future. So what's possible? She did the impossible. And so that gave me the determination that we can do it. And she fell one time. We were running, trying to catch this streetcar, and you had to put your money in the front, and then you had to leave and go to the back door to get on the streetcar. She fell. Here I was, 7 years old. I reached for the door, and I was reaching for her. I felt a sword just cut me in half. And I said to myself at age 7, when I get grown, I'm going to do something about this. I never forget that incident. So every time I got a chance to make a difference, okay? I was kidnapped in Colombia, Latin America, by the FARC 6 years ago, okay? Because we were transforming a community to get them to stand up. And that's what I do now. I help people learn how to train others to be able to stand up. With the same training I got, okay, 52 years ago, we do that. And we're able to transform a prison like Bella Vista into a nonviolent center. We have a prison now that's a nonviolent center in Medellin. We got another center in Johannesburg, the King Lutuli Transformation Center. So what I do is help establish these institutions. When I studied at Harvard University, some students followed me and set up a peace education program at Harvard University. At Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, we have courses in nonviolence and peace in every department. One of the things that we have failed to do in our educational system is to infuse nonviolence so that people will have these tools so that when they run into conflicts, they don't have to use violence, or either when they run into violence, they know how to respond in a nonviolent way. And that was the thing that inspired me from the beginning. I have been so amazed at the power of nonviolence. In fact, some other people in the Middle East are discovering it too.
That's one of the things that I think people always ask about when they see people in the civil rights movement and they see them practicing nonviolence. I'd like for all of you to speak about that and how important that was in the work that you were doing as Freedom Riders. When you start, Rip?
When the workshops started in Nashville, I heard about the workshops that Jim Lawson was conducting, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I, here lately, in my years that have passed, I come across a passage in the Bible, which is Romans 12, the first and second verse. And in that first verse, it says, do not conform to this world. And I look at that as before I was a part of the movement, before I started the nonviolent workshops, that my parents were part of segregation. So they went along with segregation. They didn't mind sitting at the back of the bus or not being served downtown. And then the second part of that Romans 12 says, do not conform to this world, but be transformed. And so I look at that as being, once I started in the movement, I went over to the transform. I was transformed. And I've lived that life ever since. And so I joined the movement because it was in Nashville, my hometown, and I wanted to do something for Nashville. And I did. And so when it came to the Freedom Rides, there was no question as to whether or not I was going to be a part of that.
Genevieve, was nonviolence transformative for you as it was for Rip?
Yes, it was. I had to learn it from scratch. Didn't come naturally to me, but when I was exposed to it, I knew it was the right way. And at other times in my life, for instance, I have found a shelter for battered women, which has the same thing in back of it, you know, and trying to end violence against women, which is very pervasive in our society, unfortunately. So I always kept that in mind, and I'm not an absolute pacifist, but I'm pretty close to it.
Since you raised this question about nonviolence, just one thing I think is important, and that is we must understand why people behave the way they do. When we saw this violence that took place, the bus burning and all that sort of thing, the first step towards nonviolence is trying to put yourself in the other person's position. That is to try to see through their eyes the world that they see. Because people behave towards you based on their perception of you and their perception of themselves. And so before you can ever even start to solve the problem, you got to look at the world through their eyes, at least try. I was a Nashville student, you know, and I was studying at night, and I used to turn on radio trying to get some music, you know, to study and trying to relax. In Nashville, how many country stations they got? I don't know. That's all I can hear. And, you know, we grew up in the South, and I used to see my parents change station, hee-haw, and, you know, Grand Ole Opry and stuff like that. So what happened is I said, okay, I give up, all right. I'm just going to stop. I could hear them, But now I'm going to listen. So I just put everything down, and I'm going to listen. You know what I heard? She was poor, but she was honest, victim of a rich man's pride. When she met that Christian gentleman, Big Jim Folsom, and she had a child by him. It's the rich who gets the glory. It's the poor who gets the blame. It's the same the whole world over. Now ain't that a dirty crying shame? Now he sits in the legislature making laws for all mankind while she roamed the streets of Coleman, Alabama, selling grapes from her grapevine. This was a little girl who, this big senator, who ended up being the governor, he got the girl pregnant down in Coleman, Alabama. She wasn't selling grapes from her grapevine. We know what she was selling. Once you listen, that old country music is nothing but white folks' blues. They had the same feelings, the same problems. It was the rich who got the glory for them, the poor who got the blame. And see, once you look at their lives through their eyes, okay, then you can understand why they don't feel good about themselves, why they would go and put on a white sheet, because they couldn't afford a robe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right?
So once you're looking through the other person's perspective, that puts you in a place to really be able to activate nonviolence then.
Yes. Because what they like in their lives is somebody to respect them and for them to be able to feel good about themselves and be able to share the best of themselves rather than the worst. When people bring out the worst of themselves, it's because they can't discover the best in themselves. So nonviolence is a thing that gives them an example of how they can bring the best out of themselves as we try to bring the best out of ourselves.
Okay. Now, all of you, it's established. We've seen the film. We've read your stories. We know you are totally committed to this. Once you applied, you wanted to do it, you did it, and no matter what, you were going to stay in it to the end. That's established. But for the rest of us out here, we want to know what scary moment came. It didn't shake your commitment, but it gave you a moment of pause during these very brutal times of the Freedom Rides. Just one moment. Genevieve?
Well, I wasn't too happy when I was in the airport, and I noticed that the restrooms, which of course were separate, 4 separate restrooms, were hidden behind a wall, and you had to open the door and go down into a place where there were no other people. And it was a very, very vulnerable situation. That was where anybody who didn't like you could just take care of you at no time, and, just like that. Well, I tried to avoid that restroom because I knew there was only danger there. And I looked around at my fellow Freedom Riders. Joe Perkins was standing in front of a window, and I walked up to him. We weren't very well organized, you see. We were just roaming around the airport. I said, Joe, why are you standing here with your back to everyone? And he pointed at the window, and I realized it reflected behind him. That all he had to do was look at that window, and he knew exactly what's behind him. Mm-hmm. Well, that was Joe Perkins. He was always thinking. And I sort of admired his tactical ability. He was, he's disappeared, unfortunately.
Rip, for you,
I think the one moment for me was when I was released from Parchman.
Let's put a pause, and y'all know Parchman now. That was not a jail. That was the penitentiary. Go ahead.
Normally, when people were released, they were the smallest number were 2. The attorney Young would come from Jackson and pick 2 people up and take them back to Jackson. The day that I was released, I was the only one, and so it was just the attorney and I traveling from Parchman back to Jackson, and anything could happen to both of us on that long ride. And I think that was the only time and the first time that I had ever had any kind of fear at all. Perhaps maybe if Bernard was there to sing me a country song, and, or one of the other riders, if there had been two of us in the car plus the attorney, it may have been a different feeling. But going back to Jackson it wasn't frightening. I just didn't feel at ease being in the car with him by myself.
Gave you pause.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Bernard Lafayette, your moment.
I had to search for that moment, but I don't know if you remember when we got to Parchman, we were singing all the way and that kind of thing. You know, the sheriff said to us, he said, "All right, you're at Parchman now. Let's see how much singing you're gonna do now." So I mean, like we've been singing in all the other jails, and we got to Parchman. They took us in one by one, and the person who went in before you didn't see him. And the other thing is, when you walked in, behind that door, they said, take off all of your clothes. You had to strip naked, one by one. And you didn't know what happened to the other person. And that took me back to Germany. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in Mississippi, it was a state-run operation, okay? It was sovereign state of Mississippi, and we didn't know what sovereignty they had and what they would do to people. And I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and I had a lot of Jewish friends. In fact, I was driving at age 14. I was driving a car with a license because these Jewish family took me in, and I used to work at their grocery store. They wanted me to drive the truck to deliver groceries, so they took me out on Sundays, and trained me how to drive. I had my driver's license at 14. So I had a lot of contact, and so therefore I had a lot of exposure to what some of those situations was like. And that's the thing that sort of a moment when I was wondering whether or not there was going to be a repeat.
John Lewis says in the film that all of you were never the same after this experience. Do you agree? And if you were changed in some way, what way was it?
Well, I know that when I returned to Nashville, I didn't stop. Just Freedom Rides are over or about to be over. I continued to work. The young lady that was on the Pauline Knight that said, I'm going on the Freedom Ride, no one's going to stop me. Well, we worked together after we were released on Kroger and H.G. Hills on desegregating those two big food stores. And shortly after that, I was asked to come to New York and to be a fundraiser for CORE, for the Freedom Rides, and I did that for a year. But things have really, for me, I guess, I got away from the movement for a while, and everything was kind of went to sleep. And then when I moved back to Nashville in 1991, I read a newspaper article about myself. They said that he was back in town, first of all, they called me, and I said, well, how do they know that I'm back in Nashville? And then the Tennessean, they asked to come over and do an interview, and they did. And I said, well, I'm back, and I'm back home where it all started, and I'm ready to get started again. And so since 1991, when Bernard called me and we did a retracing of the Freedom Rides with 2 bus loads from 8 to 81 or 8 to 98. So I've been active ever since.
So I should have said this is really a 2-part question because you gave me a beautiful recitation of what you've been doing. What I want to know is, have you been changed emotionally? Were you changed emotionally from that experience?
Yes, I was changed emotionally from that experience, and you see the change sitting right across from you. Wasn't too much of a change. I didn't have to make much of a change. I've always been, as Clark Kent would say, I'm the mild-mannered person that I've always been. And I was never a violent person as a young person. So I guess I was meant to be just that nonviolent person.
Okay.
And my mother, as she grew older, she would worry about things. I said, Mom, worrying is going to take you away from here. And so I don't worry about things because that works on your whole body. And so being a part of the Freedom Rides, I didn't worry about it. I knew that I would be safe. One way or the other, I was going to be safe. I knew that I was going to make it through that because of my experience in Nashville with the sit-in. And I knew I had people like John Lewis and Bernard and Bevels and Diane, and I could go on and on and on behind me. And they knew that I had their backs because that's the way we did it in Nashville. Okay.
Genevieve, were you changed, as John Lewis said, and
Well,
if so, how?
Remember, I was a municipal bond analyst. You couldn't go through that without changing a lot. He's looking at me like, really? So yes, I was changed. I became a sort of social activist, and it moved out into many different areas. It wasn't all interracial, but all of it was aimed at social change. Practically all of it, let's say. So yes, and I was never happier than when I was busy in the civil rights movement. And I used to walk along the ground or something. I felt like I was 3 feet off the ground. I was so happy just to be doing that. It seems strange, but that, I guess it was a really new experience, and it was morally good. You know, there weren't all these ambiguities that are in the rest of life, but this seemed to me to be just about perfect.
Okay. Bernard Lafayette?
Well, once we were in jail in Jackson, Mississippi, the governor, Ross Barnett, came out in the front page newspaper congratulating the people from Mississippi for not getting involved with these northern outside agitators. And that was an insult. So when Jim Bevel and I got out of jail, we set up shop and started training folk from Jackson, Mississippi. And it was Medgar Evers and who gave us the opportunity and found a place on Lynch Street for us to have it. Tom Gaither and I, we shared office with him. He was the kind of coordinator for CORE. And within a period of about 2 weeks, we were able to get 42 people from Jackson, Mississippi on the Freedom Rides. They didn't have to get on the bus. They just walked into the bus station. And it didn't cost any money. I mean, it was really, you know. But here's what we did. We trained them in a very intense way when we had learned about nonviolence, because we didn't want them to get in there in jail and then all of a sudden tell the folk that we duped them or we tricked them. So Jim Bevel was the more persuasive of the two of us. And so I would tell them all the reasons they should go on the Freedom Rides, and Bevel would tell them all the reasons they shouldn't. He was from Mississippi. He made a very strong case. Your life was not going to be the same. You're not going to have certain opportunities in Mississippi. Your family might be affected by that. You might not get a job in the future, okay, because you're an embarrassment to the state of Mississippi and all that. All the reasons they shouldn't. And then, if they showed up 6 o'clock a.m. the next morning to go to jail, they could get in. If they were 15 minutes late, they had to wait till the next day. Because we had to have some, standards and criteria.
For going to jail.
Right. So people from Mississippi had a little more difficulty passing the course. But when we took them down, not one turned around. There was no turning around with them. With Warren Brown, I can name all of them. Jimmy Travis, all those people in Mississippi who ended up there. There's two other things I want to say about Nashville. Because of the training, and that's what I emphasize, okay? That's the thing that made the difference in my life, that training. You had more people on Martin Luther King's executive staff, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, from Mississippi, okay, and all the other states and that kind of thing, you had more from Nashville than any other place. Came out of the Nashville movement. Jim Bevel, Diane Nash was on the staff, executive staff of Martin Luther King. Okay. Paul Brooks, you know, he was one of those other guys with the hat on. Of course, I had my hat on, you know. But, okay, go down the list. And myself, every campaign that Martin Luther King had, Selma, Alabama, there were folks from Nashville. Albany, Georgia, Nashville, Chicago, Albany, Georgia. Okay. Poor People's Campaign, Memphis, okay, Nashville. So the point I'm making is that it was the West Point of the nonviolent movement.
All right. I am reminded that Ray Arsenault, who is the author of this fine book, says that you all were the shock troops for the rest of the civil rights movement. And I just wanted to read this piece from his book, which talks about the impact of the rides beyond just the removing of the signs, but really the impact on shaping a nation. So, indeed, the Freedom Rides exerted an impact that transcended tangible, quantifiable changes in institutional behavior or public policy. Within 6 months of the first ride, travelers of all races were sitting side by side on buses and trains all across the nation without fear of arrest. The white and colored signs that had blighted the walls of southern bus and train stations for decades were gone. The nation's major civil rights organizations had undergone significant transformations, and the Justice Department had been pushed into a deepening engagement in civil rights matters. But even this impressive list of accomplishments does not capture the full effect of the Freedom Rides. The most important and lasting consequence, the one that confirmed the ride's status as a pivotal moment in American history, was a revolutionary change in the character of citizen politics. In the course of 6 months, the nation's first mobile, nonviolent army expanded the realm of the possible in American political and social insurgency, redefining the limits of dissent and setting the stage for the escalating demands and rising expectations of the mid and late 1960s. And the part that I wanted to focus on was the increase in citizen engagement. We talk so much about that now, this civic engagement. You all were right at the forefront of all of this. What do you say to young people now who are looking at you as role models? You had your grandmother, you had the Nashville, you had other people that you worked with that were role models for you even as you were being the shock troopers, as it were. So now, when young people look at you and they're looking for examples of civic engagement from you, what do you say to them?
Well, where I live, we have a bunch of high school students. They didn't engage in any cross-racial activities, but they were aware that the levees on the Mississippi River were so weak that if there was a heavy rain, they would be swept away. So these kids went out and monitored the levees, and then they went and talked to congressmen. They got Jerry Costello interested, and these were just high school kids. You know, of course they had a teacher who was urging them on, but I don't think she was doing it all. The only thing I regret is that she didn't stay in the background more and let these kids develop their own program. But I think it's feasible for high school kids to look around and see something that they feel is wrong and involve themselves in it. They can use nonviolence there too, you know. And I found that very inspiring, you know, at this late date, that these kids would get out there and do that. They haven't won yet, but I think they will. And that's the Army Corps of Engineers, a really tough outfit that doesn't want to do anything.
So, what lesson do you want them to take from your example, if any?
What do I want them to take?
From your example.
Well, I want them to not demand. I want them to be courteous. I want them to communicate with the people they're dealing with. I don't want them marching up and down demanding this and that and the other, at least until it's hopeless, if it should ever get to be that. But I want them to learn that, if they're determined and civil, they may get what they're trying to get. And mind you, there's no money for this. This is not something you can just reach out and say, Corps of Engineers, take care of this. It's a very, very expensive thing. And we've already had one flood about, I think it was 1996 maybe, and it wiped out all kinds of things. Not whole towns in most cases, but in some cases it did wipe out whole towns. They had to move them up on cliffs. So I want young people to feel that they can affect things and people to help them. And I'm not saying grade school people. I'm talking about people who are capable of analyzing things and can do it without getting so emotionally involved that they contradict themselves, shall we say. And I think there's a lot of that that needs to be done because essentially our politicians have deserted us. You know, they're out there working a way to enrich a lot of people who are already enriched. And it takes a lot to get them to adopt something and follow through on it. This is a terrible time in politics, I think.
Well, thank you. Rip?
I was in Memphis about 3-4 weeks ago and talked to about 600 junior high school students. And when it came to the Q&A portion of the program, there were a lot of questions, but there was one that stood out to me. The mic was out, and they would walk up to the mic, and there was a young lady sitting over on this side of the room, and she walked past the mic, came down to the foot of the stage, and she said, I want to do something. I don't know what I want to do, but I want to do something. I want to make a change. And I said to her, really think about what it is you want to do. What is it that you're passionate about? And I said, do you have any friends? And her whole class stood up and applauded to let me know that they were her friends. I said, okay, find somebody in your class that is as passionate about what it is that you want to do. And then go to your teacher, go to an advisor, go to your parents, and talk about it. And then find some civic leader that is passionate about it. And one of the things that was going on was with the teachers. They're trying to get the older teachers to retire so they can bring new teachers in at a lower rate. But we need those old teachers who have been there for a long time. And so I told them that, I said, when the Board of Education has this meeting about the teachers, I said, you could have the blue flu as a student or students. And I explained to them about the blue flu. I said, that simply means that you're sick that day and you can't go to school. But you can fill up the Board of Education's lobby and take your signs, but be quiet and orderly. And let them know that you're in favor of the teachers and you want to keep your teachers. But then when I drove back to Nashville, I caught the very end of a news report, and it was a young man who had got one of the organizations. I don't know if it was the Lions Club or the Elks or who it was, because I caught the last of it. What he was doing was he had a program called the Saturday and Sunday Breakfast. And what he did was he would have Ziploc bags with enough breakfast in it for school kids. They were fed Monday through Friday in school, but they didn't have the opportunity to have breakfast on Saturday and Sunday. So I said, I need to find out about that program. Take it back to Memphis, talk to this young lady, see if that's something that would interest her, because children will help other children. I don't think they think about, well, you live up here and I'm down here. I think they meet, and especially when it comes to helping each other. So that's a project that I'm working on that I'm going to take as soon as I get all the information. If that's not going on in Memphis, I'm going to take that back to that young lady in Memphis and to see what I can do if that's something that she would want to do.
So the lesson you want students or young people to take from you is do something.
Do something. And the other thing, I don't just talk about when I speak to young people about what they can do, and then in a sense it is what they can do. Usually you hear about our young men being placed in prisons and the downside of young men and the sagging and what have you. I talk to the young ladies about respect. And I say, now, first of all, you need to respect yourself. And if a young man doesn't treat you with respect, it's because you're not respecting yourself. And that's what our young ladies have to do first, is respect themselves. And if this young man doesn't respect you, let him go. Eventually, if he cares for you, he'll get his pants up off the ground.
Okay. So you got a whole program going along with
yes.
social activism. Gotcha.
Yes,
okay.
yes. I want to cover it all.
It's holistic in your approach.
I don't want a young man in a picket line showing his underwear.
Okay. We got you.
I don't want a young lady showing all of this.
All right.
Because when you look at this documentary, this was our normal dress. Mm-hmm. I went to school with a shirt and tie on. The only time I didn't have a shirt and tie on was when it was band rehearsal. Then I had to put on jeans and what have you to get out on the field and learn the formation and all that. But otherwise, it was a sport coat, a nice shirt, and a tie, and that was just normal.
Okay. All right. Bernard Lafayette, what do you want young people to take away from your example of civic engagement?
I want them to feel empowered, and I want them to feel that they don't have to wait until they become voting age. I don't want them to have to think that they have to get grown before they can do something about the problem. So what I'd like to see people do, and let's start in Massachusetts since it's one of the colonies, right? Yeah. This will be good. I'll come back next year and do a check and see what you've done, okay? What I want you to do is to go to every school and organize a political structure, because each school is in a congressional district. So let's start with the 12-year-olds to those who are 17. Let's have a junior political structure where they learn how to register to vote, and they elect for themselves their representatives. They actually have a voting. Some of them have student body presidents, okay? Well, let's expand it and make it real so they can actually present bills before their youth legislature, okay? And then they can look at what the adults are doing, okay? They're in Boston at the Capitol, and then they could look at those bills and decide how they want to vote on those bills. And in fact, what they can do is actually vote on the candidates. You know, their ages 12 to 17. So the junior legislature and the junior voters can vote first on the candidates so you can see what their values and their standards, okay, would be. So they have their own representatives, and they can vote on your representatives. And if bills come through the state legislature, they can vote on those bills while the other folks are making up their minds. And if they want to close down the government in the state legislature, the youth can vote to open it up, you see, and keep it going. So my point is, if you're going to drive a car, you take driver's education. If you're going to lead, okay, the community, then they need to have practice voting and participation in government. So what we were doing, actually, in the movement was participating in government. There were some laws and practices that we wanted to change, and so we went about, since we couldn't, actually, I couldn't vote because in those days you had to be 21 unless you was in Kentucky or Texas, okay? So we had to assert ourselves. Now, I want to make it very clear in terms of breaking the law. Civil disobedience is different from breaking the law. Civil disobedience means you respect the law to the point where you are completing the process. Each law has a rule. And then if you break that rule, they have a consequence. So that's why we accepted the consequence. We didn't break the law and then run someplace and try to avoid it. We accepted the punishment. We willingly went to jail. But we were breaking the law in order to change the law. So we had respect for law, but those particular ones we wanted to change that practice. So I would like to see us form youth legislators and elections and that sort of thing in every state. And then we could bring them together in a convention, and they can decide on which candidates they really want for themselves, for their legislature, and then vote on the adult legislature and the bills and that sort of thing. And then you know what you can do? You can predict what's going to happen next, because you got that next generation. They're voting at 17 in the youth legislature, and guess what they're doing at 18? Okay?
We got it. Yes. Okay. All right, so I'm about to open up the floor to questions from our wonderful panelists here. Approach the microphone, say your name, ask your question, and they'll be happy to answer. I see people moving. I've never had a shy crowd here. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Good evening. As a former FIS student, I want to thank you all for being here, and also want to say that leaving the institution not too long ago, that we still are indoctrinated in the reverence of the spirit of the sit-ins and also the Freedom Rides. But I had a question. While I was there at Fisk, when they were telling us about the Freedom Rides and the sit-ins, they also expressed to us, some professors, the extent that race may not be our issue as though it was yours in this time. And so I want to find out if you agree with that. And if you disagree with that, what do you think the injustice of this time would be? There was statements made focusing on socioeconomic status rather than race would be more of our issue. Is race is mute? Should we just let that go and focus on something else?
I'll take a shot. I don't think concentrating entirely on racial issues is too productive, because we now have some really devastating issues that have to be addressed, and one is poor people and their economy. Unless poor people can work, they're out of the system. There's nothing for them. And as far as I'm concerned, there's plenty of black poor people and there's plenty of white poor people. And it would be very good for them to work together, because I don't think you can win if you allow yourself as poor people to be divided and just beat up on each other. And there's people around who would love that.
I have to respond to that, because we never talked about this. Race was never a problem. What race? As the song said, the white folks were treated just like the black folks were treated. The poor whites didn't have anything either. Okay? In some places, they don't allow them to have unions. All right? What's the third world? What kind of world is that? No. This whole business of looking at color and ethnicity was an artificial barrier to line of demarcation to determine who is going to be poor, okay, and those who are going to be rich. And those are a few people. They're not all white. All right? So we got to get rid of this myth. All right? The race becomes a convenient way to determine who is going to have nothing, who's going to have need, and who's going to have greed. Nigeria? Oil. We got more oil coming in from Nigeria. How is it that the Nigerians are on the bottom and they are suffering in the places where I've been? They don't have schools, they don't have roads, and these people here are angry. That's why they got guns, and that's why they're arming themselves and shooting and kidnapping people. Okay? That ain't nothing to do with no race. That has to do with, okay, some people manipulating other folk. The reason they didn't want black and whites to sit together, it wasn't about race. They didn't want them to start talking to each other and finding out, okay, what happened in Coleman, Alabama. All right? They wanted to keep us separated from each other. Most of your segregation was actually horizontal, not vertical. They didn't want you to sit down together, sitting on the bus, sitting on the plane, sitting in the park, sitting at the lunch counter. Folks start talking, and they start finding out they got more in common than the things they have different. Okay? So the point is, they use this race stuff as a smoke screen to exploit all of us. That's what's happening. All right? So they put us against each other. What happened to the Chinese who were here? We know what they did to the Japanese during World War II. All right? We know what they did to the Native Americans, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay? So the point I'm making is that let's cut it in terms of a reality. So what happened is the same issues we were dealing with, you're dealing with them today. And that's what she's saying. Okay? Exactly. So what we've got to do is really look at how we can change the distribution of the resources that we have. And the jobs she's talking about, you know where they're going if they don't have no job?
Jail.
They got money for jail, right? And the folks who are going to get jobs are the folks who are going to help keep folks in jail. All right? That's a guaranteed job, isn't it? Correctional officers.
We have a lot of them down where I come from.
Yeah, and lawyers.
All right. Thank you for your response.
Thanks. Here comes another one.
You own it.
Okay, this is our last question, I'm told.
First, I want to say thank you all very much. My name is Kenneth Holmes, and I just want to say that I'm from Mississippi. I'm 10 years old when you guys were down there. I know Parchman very well. I know Ross Barnett very well. I knew all of those people very well. I grew up in Mississippi. But, you know, I was listening to the two answers, and I actually believe that there are a lot of things that we need to address. But I would like to ask Mr. Patton, I think his name is, Rip over here, this question, because I've heard two answers. Are you telling me that in America today, if two men walk into an office and both have on a suit, that there are no issues between the black man and the white man who might get that job? I want to hear it from someone else. I've heard sort of that. Are you saying that there's no longer an issue like that today?
No, I didn't say that.
No, I know you didn't. I want to hear your answer to that.
I think there's still an issue. Even not only walking into an office and trying to secure a job, if you put in an application for a home and over the phone or on the internet, and you go down to the actual office, there's a possibility that that home has already been sold. And then, for example, say our cameraman, go down to that same office, he can get that home. I think that still exists.
Thank you very much. I'll let you add more to say. I want to make sure that I understand that very well.
Did I?
Yes, you did. You did answer that. I want to make sure that there are a lot of issues that are there, but that issue is still very prevalent in America, and I just want to make sure.
And let me add one thing. It has nothing to do with homes. I was speaking at Iowa State University about 3 weeks ago, and a young lady walked up to me, and she has some connections with Mississippi. I don't remember the town that's in Mississippi, but she said that a friend of hers wrote to her, and there is a chicken farm in this town where blacks work at a minimal wage. Mexican Americans are moving into this town. They are firing the blacks, hiring Mexican Americans at even a lower rate of pay. I don't have a problem with Mexican Americans moving anywhere they want to move. The problem is I think that the Mexican Americans should demand equal pay, if not more. And so hopefully when we have our reunion in Chicago, that will be addressed. I know that Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian, Reverend Lawson are working in some of the counties in Mississippi. And that's something that will be addressed about wages and equal pay. So when we have our reunion, there's a lot of things that are going to happen that we're going to talk about immediately after the Oprah show.
So 50 years ago, 20-year-old Bernard Lafayette said he could not live his life with segregation. 28-year-old Genevieve Houston said, I've never felt so good as doing this work, and it's morally correct. And 21-year-old Ernest Rip Patton said, I will not be moved, and I will have a commitment that will be a lifetime commitment. They are Freedom Riders. Give them a hand.